Welcome everybody to the Quilt Podcast, episode number 4. Today's theme is healing in this moment. Today is June 23rd, 2021. My name is Brett Grant. I am Research and Policy Director at Voices for Racial Justice. And I'm here with my co-host, Gabriella, Anais, Deal-Marquez. And today we will be talking with our guests, Ayo Clemons, Alemayehu, and Ricardo Levins Morales. So the Quilt Podcast is a collaboration between Voices for Racial Justice, the UpTake Community News, and other Minnesota-based community partners. The podcast fosters conversations at the intersection of public policy, community organizing, journalism, art, and healing. Season 1 seeks to understand and answer the question, what is this moment calling for us to do together? And so to take us deeper into that, I will pass it on to my co-host, Gabi.
So I want to start us off with a nod of gratitude, of recognition, of respect to this land that many of us call home, Minnesota Makoche, and the Dakota people who steward and protected this place where I currently live, Minneapolis. And just also wanting to ground our entry point into this conversation into a deeper naming of the strong historical legacy of Native organizing locally that is deeply, has deeply informed many movements across generations. And of course, there's really powerful current organizing that requires support and solidarity work across community. Particularly, I think about, as we're gathering today, the organizing happening to stop Line 3, which would be cutting through northern Minnesota, destroying sacred wild rice beds on Anishinaabe territory. So I ground and honor that sacred work that is not just about sovereignty of Indigenous people, it also impacts every single one of our lives and in this earth that sustains us. So today I bring my own Indigenous ancestors into the sacred conversation with humility and gratitude. I uplift my Purepecha, Masawa, Chichimeca, abuelitos for the infinite care and wisdom that continues to help me find grounding in breath and body. So this moment, this year that we have been living collectively, so many different things happening, has really been asking us to tap into ancient wisdom. Living through a global pandemic, witnessing just the brutal reminders of the violence of white supremacy and its many iterations, the constant cost on the lives of Black, Indigenous, and folks of color, and then all the grief and anger that has emerged and will continue to in our hearts and bodies because of the nature of what we're living. This is it feels like a cracking open of how things have been and how things could be, and this continuous coming face to face with the lies of what dominant culture, what white supremacy culture has been telling us about ourselves and each other for so long. We're really being taken to task of what it means to hold and move through conflict and through pain in a way that can transform us all in the process. And today's conversation really feels so on time of, what does it look like to hold some nuance and care and heart on grounding healing as we're actively imagining and creating a new world. And we're joined by such an incredible group of people that we're lucky to be in relationship with and in community with, artists and organizers and healers. And so it's really going to be a joy. I really can't wait for this crew of people that are going to just be holding space with us all, and as we dive deeper into what healing in this moment is looking like for our communities.
So as a way to kind of get the conversation started, we really wanted to ask each one of you what your healing journey has been like and how you define healing for yourselves. And so as you introduce yourself, that's what we would ask you to share, is just some thoughts about those two questions. And I'd like to begin with Ayo.
Thank you. And thanks again so much for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. I feel very, very blessed to get to be here, to talk with you all, and to get to, just be together in community and support some conversations around healing and community through this, through our time together. So let's see, I'm Ayo Clemons. I am a global somatics practitioner, meaning I do body work and some light breath work techniques, massage, craniosacral. My background is in doing community organizing and community support work. I was doing that for, I don't know, about 10 or so years before I started getting more into doing healing work. And I got into it because I could see that our leaders, our community organizers, people who are on the front lines in so many different ways. If it was in organizing and activism, teachers, essential workers, so many people who were organizing to make things happen in their communities were and still are impacted by the trauma of the legacy of colonialism, white supremacy. I could see how our leaders were struggling and how some of the things that we would say that we were working against were actually coming out in our relationships directed at each other. And so I took a step back, decided to focus more on my own healing, and then went to school to learn some techniques, to learn some tools that I might be able to share with my community and learn some practices, really. I think it's important to make that distinction between tools and practice, because so often, capitalist culture makes everything objectified. And so it's, there's constantly like a gathering of tools. Let me learn this tool and that tool and that tool and that tool. And tools are, good. They definitely get us places. But I think that, in connection to the conversation that we're having today, it's important that we get to practice becoming who we are in a deeper way. And that means that we get to practice the embodiment of the things that we want to see in the world, which doesn't always just come from the application of a tool, but it's really about a paradigm shift and shifting the way we are with ourselves and with each other. So even that understanding has been a big piece of my healing journey. I just need to sit with it for a sec, because it's a big question. I'm like, a healing journey. I mean, I could go in just on this last year alone, let alone a lifetime, and who knows how many lifetimes. I mean, I feel like, I would say what it's been like for me is kind of all of the ways that we experience life is a part of the healing journey, right? So sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder, sometimes I'm angry, I'm sad, sometimes I feel alone in it, sometimes I feel very connected to community. I think that maybe just centering it in this last period of time, this last year since the pandemic, it's definitely been a lot of sitting with things that feel uncomfortable and working to just be with them. That's such a big question. I think a big part of what my journey has been like, though, has been in regard to just practicing deeper compassion for myself and for others, especially with the understanding that so many of us have been triggered this year. We've all been through so much, lost so many people. We're based here in Minneapolis, so I live a mile away from where George Floyd was murdered in one direction, and then in the other direction of my home is where the protests were happening. And so I think that a lot of us are still, if we're not cognizantly aware of it, but still processing the trauma from last summer. And so a big part of my own personal journey is that I have just been working to create more space and time to be able to be with the emotions as they're coming up, and then to remember that trauma, the way it manifests, it can look very different for everybody. And so even though this time, the time that we're in, it's been prophesized, it's, we're in a time of great transformation. Communities, indigenous communities in particular, all over the world have been talking about the time that we're in right now, right? It's kind of this sink or swim time. And I know what has helped me to swim, and what has helped me to float at times, is that practice of compassion and the understanding that what we're going through and what we're holding looks different for everybody. And one thing I feel I hear a lot of people say is that, all this time the veil is lifting, which I believe it is. I think it's fascinating to be and really deep, to be feeling things at a more visceral level, like many of us are. A lot of people are coming more in tune with their intuitive abilities, whatever they may be, and it can be overwhelming for the system, and people exhibit different behaviors in connection to that. But one thing that I keep hearing people say is that, this is a time where we're seeing the truth. We're seeing people's true colors come out, and, there's all this call out culture stuff going on, and, all of that. But I think it's just important to say, for myself and for what I've been seeing for others as well, is that I think we're seeing a lot of what happens when people are under a lot of pressure and maybe haven't had the space to be able to process the things that have happened to them, that have happened to their people, that have been passed down to us through generations. And we're going to be exhibiting different behaviors that are in connection to that, those unmet wounds that we are now collectively having the opportunity to get to meet together and to get to heal and to be with. So I think I'll pause there and pass it to whoever would like to speak next. Yeah, thank you.
Looks like you're already unmuted, Louis.
Yeah, I am. And it probably makes sense for me to go next because I'm really, really tired. Good question. I think the whole concept of healing has dominated my life because I'm the descendant of really profounded, wounded people who somehow were able to maintain their capacity to have love and compassion, not only for their family, but for people that they could identify as their extended family and community. And they passed on that to me. And I feel those people in my body, and I feel them as active ancestors who speak to me mostly through this ear. And it took me a long time to realize that what I used to think were, the weird thoughts of a child were actually my ancestors talking to me and coming through me. And, the reason I was an odd child was that I was speaking things that they were giving me that I shouldn't have known as like a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. And it allowed some of my ancestors, some of those people who are now ancestors who were present with me, to say, oh, we need to take this boy under wing and protect him from some of the world so that he knows he has people who see him, value him, and are pushing him out into the world as he may become ready. When I was 3 going on 4, one Thanksgiving, one of my my granduncle came up from rural northeastern Arkansas to spend Thanksgiving with the family. And we were gathered in the old neighborhood where my mother and father grew up, which was an Orthodox Jewish community that gradually transformed into an African American community. And my Aunt Emma brought me out into the hallway where my granduncle Daniel was, who was a backwoods preacher who supposedly had the gift of prophecy, but some people just thought he was a crazy man. And my Aunt Emma asked him, what did he see for me? And he said that I would be either a preacher or a doctor. And as I began to emerge as an artist, as a poet, eventually I discovered that poetry was the vehicle through which I would express healing energy. And so it's through that vehicle of what my granduncle saw in me that began to manifest or be present through me as an artist, as a poet, as a performer, as a community organizer, and a few other things. So when I began to perform with this group called Ancestor Energy, with a brother who's now an ancestor named Kerry Thomas, he and I particularly said that the work that we did with music and spoken word and song was, the purpose of it was healing. And I've been blessed to be introduced to paradigms in the modern contemporary world where people reclaimed or began to channel things that were actually ancient indigenous wisdom, but they kind of translated it into contemporary terms that allowed people to have present time experiences of receiving and also giving healing energy. One of those paradigms is called process-oriented psychology, which has a whole paradigm called world work that brings people together from a lot of different cultural paradigms to somehow together define what the common ground is so that they can vision together, do conflict, engage in conflict in ways that help people. Conflict is a way of healing and seeing who we really are and identifying the common ground that we live on. Another paradigm that I found very helpful is co-counseling, where people trade time just listening to one another and encouraging one another to feel the trauma and stress in their body and to release it, to like let it go, recognize it, let it go. And the other thing that I've learned a lot from in terms of healing, which is accessible and immediate and just about anybody can do it, is our both yoga and meditation. So I find myself now at a time in life as an elder who has relationships with people from a wide spectrum of cultures, that my real role is to promote healing and to support younger artists and activists who are making transformational change by how they organize, by how they build community, by how they create and share art in all its forms. And maybe realizing that what we call art is just a normal way of being human and connected to the natural world, the animals, the vegetation, the mineral world, that all of that are our relatives, alive and full of energy and knowledge that we need in order to recognize that there's this, that if we're reclaiming our indigenous wisdom and practice, the central idea is that all of life is interconnected. And when you understand that and grasp it, it gives you an incredible challenge in terms of releasing the delusional ideas about being individuals. That, you know, somebody as profound as Frida Kahlo or James Baldwin, they emerged out of communities and were connected to communities of artists and activists. They really weren't just singular human beings. They were connected to people in just expansive and deep ways. So I'll stop there.
Well, I guess I should start here then, where Louis has brought us, Ayo. First of all, thank you for creating this container for conversation. It's so important to be able to stop rushing so fast and sit down and be able to be with each other, even if it's over some distance. And I found as an organizer that you could pick any handful of people, give them the space and the time and some good things to eat and drink, and just wait for the wisdom to emerge. You know, that it's there, it's natural, and we are so bombarded with distractions that we don't even know it ourselves, right? So, wow, your question, dang. I mean, healing is a lifelong process. Lifelong. I feel like I was really had an advantage of growing up in the forest, where the story that I got from my surroundings all the time was about life and loss and death and decay and regeneration, about ebbs and flows, resources accumulating and then depleting, cycles. So that my own experiences of loss, I think, were always in some way coupled with the idea of that being part of a cycle that's linked to regeneration. The Molly Glasgow, healing practitioner and organizer, likes to point out that healing begins the second that injury begins. Mm-hmm. The body starts to mobilize, the community starts to mobilize, the soil starts to mobilize. And that will go through stages, but it's inherent in what organisms do, organizers also, that the circulation of our blood, our breath, cell regeneration. We're always repairing, because just the wear and tear of living involves loss and injury, right? So even if we're not facing major traumas or assaults, we're always facing loss and repair. Now, I think healing is both the same and different on the individual and collective level. Our individual injuries are so much shaped by an oppressive environment, global system that produces injury, that can only survive by separating ourselves from our true nature. And I can do a lot of healing my own injuries, even within that system, but healing myself doesn't heal the collective injury. That requires collective work, and that's a level on which I have often kind of focused my efforts. For some reason, I don't know how this happened, but a lot of times, I mean, trauma really shakes up our sense of safety. Traumatic injury does, and we have a lot of different ways. Some people feel safe by fighting everyone around them, keeping them at a distance to find safety. And I don't know how it happened, but at a very early age, I got this notion that I could only be safe if everybody else was. That creating safety in the world is the way I create a nest that I can relax in. So that's been my work, and that's my healing work. And I found that as I've learned more about that and become more aware of what my art, my visual art is, a lot of it is reframing traumatic narratives for people, which is part of the healing process. Changing the story, right? And I find that through that work, when that work is helpful to other people in their healing process, that sends a message to my heart, to my nervous system, that healing is possible. And then that in itself is deeply healing. So when I think about collective injury especially, I think of healing as the process of coming home to ourselves, which again is instinctive. Right? We're always trying to do that. And it's a question of how do we remove the toxins that keep us from doing what we're naturally created to do. We have internal navigation systems, but they get all messed up, right? It's like the whales who can't find their way home because of naval sonar messes up their own sonar means of communication, right? Whales aren't running ashore on beaches because they're dumb. It's because their natural capacity is being interfered with. In a personal sense, I think that part of my healing process at this stage in my life has to do with recognizing truths about myself. You know, when I landed in the States from Puerto Rico, it was the perfect storm of adolescence, revolution, immigration, followed by dropping out of high school and leaving home at 15 and all of those things. And I've always had this survivor self-narrative about how well I navigated that, how prepared I was, how mature I was. And I think all that narrative is not a false narrative, but I'm really also coming to terms with the price that I paid for that and the injuries involved. The fact that physically, and I'm sure Ayo would have a lot to say about this, physically, I had experienced a lot of injury. My skeleton, starting with my arches and slowly working up to my neck, got all out of line. I was dealing with a lot of pain, which I think has to do with those experiences of leaving the colony with all its beauty and pain and landing in the empire, a settler empire with all of its beauty and pain. And just coming to terms with my own failings, right? My own weaknesses, and helping myself to realize that that doesn't reduce my ability to contribute, it increases it. Because that's who we all are as humans. And the final thing I wanted to say about this moment in history, and this also echoes a lot of what both my siblings have been talking about, but specifically referring to what Ayo said about this moment pulling away the veil, and how often that's used as kind of a code for white people noticing what everyone else has known all along. But I think it's also important to recognize that the way we deal with sudden acute wounds being open is different than the way we deal with chronic injury, right? The coping mechanisms are different. That even people who have lived with knowledge of racism, brutality, empire their whole lives, this is still a different experience, because the coping mechanisms that we use to navigate that every frigging day have also taken a lot of damage, and that messes with us, right, in ways that can be healing, damaging, both, and a lot depends on how we navigate this next turbulent period.
That's such a beautiful segue, and I really am grateful for the grounding and connecting what is the individual healing journey, and then also the collective, which we are experiencing so many collective aspects of healing. So this next question is, what is this particular moment we're living in calling us to do together in the context of healing?
I feel like I spoke on it a little bit earlier, and so I'm actually curious to hear what Ricardo or Louis might have to say, and then I can chime in a little bit after to build on that.
Well, I've been talking, so it's my turn to inhale.
One of the things I talk about that I think both of you might have had some reference to it is that we live in a prophetic time that Indigenous people all over the world have made reference to through their stories, to their songs, and other dynamics of their culture. I remember as a lot younger man reading a book by a German scholar who had been studying African and African American literature. And he was saying that the difference between Africans and contemporary Europeans was that Europeans tended to want to separate things, put them in silos, have categories for them, and not acknowledge that there was an interrelationship between all of that. Where when Africans were not coming from a colonized place, but being who they were in a very traditional indigenous way, they were always interested in the interrelationship amongst things. And that the culture worked well when people were building, honoring, and maintaining relationship. And I always have this problem of when I start off answering a question or beginning a story, I just get totally lost in the whole process. So I don't know where I am anymore. And I don't know if I've answered the question.
Maybe you get totally lost, or maybe totally found.
But when I was listening to you, Ricardo, I was remembering that a bunch of years ago, maybe decades, I was listening to your sister and your mother talk about the content of a book they collaborated on. And all of a sudden, I understood myself in a way I hadn't before. Because as I remember it, they were talking about the way I was hearing them, what it meant to have a mixed heritage, to be from a multiplicity of cultural roots. And all of a sudden, I just felt this sense of, oh, there's nothing wrong with who I am. And the people and the cultures and the art that I feel connected to all kind of made sense all of a sudden.
Mm.
And to return to the whole idea of healing, it seems to me that we've all been encouraged to look at the world through lenses that break up the world into pieces. And that when we come to this place of feeling, seeing, understanding in this indigenous way, that we are connected to this natural world. And when we are looking through these lenses that help us see the wholeness and just the profound elegance of this creation that we live within, there is this sense of healing and purpose and fire about speaking that, singing that, writing that, sharing that in all the ways that we can share in terms of food and story and song. And in that sharing, there's this healing that takes place because we return to who we authentically are. And we begin to have this discernment about, yeah, there's this logic in the Western world that keeps us looking at the world in a fragmented way. But that logic, there's something not authentic about it. And when we, oh, I'm losing language, and I feel like maybe I've said enough and I should just drop it right here. Listening to all of you, I realize that I'm in relationship with all of you in ways that we don't often talk about, but I know that we're relatives and that we're on the same journey, but maybe not doing exactly the same things.
You've heard it observed that Northern Europeans like the food on their plate separate and not touching, whereas Mediterraneans and most other people in the world, they mess it all up, right? They got all the vegetables and the meat mixed up with the rice and the spices, right? So just interesting, right? Yeah, so, I mean, there's so many different ways to answer that question that would be all right in their own way. You know, the question about what next, right? And I think, like Lewis was talking about, placing ourselves, right? Placing ourselves where we belong in the web of life, in relation to nature, in relation to each other. And that's also true in relation to history. And so my first thought is that, well, what we need to do in this next period is what we need to do in every period that ever was and ever will be, and that's place ourselves. When there's a loud noise, animals, whether it's a dog or a bird or deer, will stop, turn toward the direction of the sound and become very still to find out what's going on. It's called orienting, right? So we need to orient, and that's a skill that's been lost because we are so reactive. And because we don't have a sense of a larger landscape, I think there's a loss of hope. Because if you have the idea that there is safety somewhere, there is a place to go to, then you develop the skills to get there. If you don't really believe they exist, then you don't develop those skills, right? So I see our work always, in a sense, I see my life's work, your life's work, all of our work as being weaving together the ancient past with the ancient future. And the present is where we get to do that, right? And it's not to idealize the past, but for all of the harm that has existed in past societies, capitalism is the first one that actually makes it a sacred principle that you not think of the consequences of your actions, that you not consider the costs of what you're doing. That's the operating system. That's the secret to its dynamism and its destructiveness. So I think that placing ourselves, and that means going back to what I said about the forest, the cycles, right? If we know, I mean, one of the most damaging things that happens to us is not having a healthy policy on disappointment, because disappointment happens, right? And you need to be prepared for it. And the way to be prepared is through knowledge and through thinking ahead. If you've been in prison for 10 years thinking about nothing about getting out, and you get out, what do you do if it's disappointing? If the people who you thought would catch you are expecting you to carry them, and all the doors are slammed in your face because you have a record, right? What you need to think about that so you can get through that turbulent period, like getting through the surf so you can get out to calm waters when you're on the shore. But that piece about disappointment, I think, is important right now, because in this period of disruption, a lot of hopes are raised, and we have to be able to separate the false ones from the true ones. I've seen cycles like this before, and I can say that there's a lot of transformation happening in people that is genuine. We need to be able to give it containers so that it can carry forward and not be lost. But there's some real stuff happening. There's also a lot of camouflage. A lot of major commitments, institutional commitments, funding commitments, governmental commitments that will evaporate within 2 years or so. They're just part of the survival mechanism of the system that when we make a lot of noise, all of a sudden becomes our best friend until we settle down again. And we're starting to see some of that fall. But we have to be able to understand that so that when it happens, it's not devastating. It's just what happens. And we're preparing for that, for the sustainability that we need, so that we're not just totally responding to their agenda, their strategies, and our little hearts and our nervous systems, et cetera, just being buffeted by them. If we are anchored in the distant past, and we need to understand our history, anchored in the distant future, because that's what we're moving toward, and there are people there waiting for us, then I think we're much better able to deal with the confusions of the present.
Whew. I am loving this conversation. My heart is beating fast listening to you both speak, and yeah, I'm loving it so much. As I'm listening to you, I'm reminded of practice in generative somatics. You both might be familiar, you all might be familiar with it, and it's a practice that is, I would say, another form of orienting. I know in the somatic world, we talk about orienting, and really just as a formal practice of taking a moment, grounding into your seat, feeling your feet on the ground, turning from your hips, looking over each shoulder and taking your time, and I invite anyone who's listening maybe to just take a moment to do that, to look over your left shoulder, turning at your hips, and slowly to make your way around the room, to notice if there's anything that draws your attention, that feels good, that feels life-giving, life-affirming to look at, and just to be with it for a moment, just to drink it in and notice what happens in your body, what happens in your system as you're there for just a moment. And then continuing to look over the other shoulder and taking that in and coming back to center. That practice of being able to turn our necks and turning at our hips is, a very deep biological way that we were able to look around and survey our environments to see if we were safe, to see if we were protected. And I'm just thinking of, this fast-paced culture. It's like you're running from one thing to the next, gotta go here, gotta go there, that maybe we don't get the chance to be able to look around. And so I just wanted to bring in that practice of orienting from that kind of general somatic perspective. And somatic is a really big term, by the way. There's like at least 70 different kinds of somatic work, and certain types of somatic work are getting a little bit more play right now. But one of them, which I think is really great, is generative somatics. And the process of orienting that they will bring in is one that's very connected to indigenous cultures, in particular in connecting with the 4 directions. But the way that they do it is how I've experienced it is, again, connecting with your feet on the ground, your seat in the chair, and coming into a sense of the length in your body. And when you're feeling into that sense of length, allowing your spine to rise up and feeling into a sense of dignity. And then moving from, and I'm speaking through it pretty briefly, just for the sake of time, but it's a really beautiful practice. Coming into that sense of dignity, noticing and expanding from that place of dignity in the center and expanding out into that sense of width. And as you feel into that sense of width, remembering that that is connected to our relationships. And then as you're experiencing that sense of width, even looking around at the people in the room or the space that's around you, and noticing how connected you feel or maybe don't feel to the people and places that are surrounding you. And then noticing and feeling into a sense of your back body, feeling your ancestors and feeling into a sense of them. And then moving into a sense of your front body, and coming into that sense of all of those who are our descendants, all of the young ones who are in the world right now, all of the things that have yet to be created, yet to be born. And I love that practice as a way to feel into in our bodies, and a way to anchor in, and remember that sense of our connection to the land, that sense of our inherent dignity and wisdom, the connection that we have to our ancestors, who I believe are with us, supporting us all the time. I mean, our ancestors are here supporting this conversation right now, and it helps to bring us through time, but also into that sense of relationship. About safety, something like, and correct me if I'm saying this wrong, Ricardo, but something like, if you don't believe safety exists, it's hard to get there. Is that, yeah, close. But I mean, it really resonates with me, because I in connection to the question, I'm really curious about how we can be those reservoirs of spirit and connection and safety for one another, and to be able to get to practice that in the fullness of our authenticity. So not in a way where it's like, I'm going to override things and shut down what I actually say or feel to help someone to feel safe, but really allowing that truth of who we are and our wisdom, our innate wisdom, to come through and help to inform an experience that we have with each other, and also be able to meet that other person in the fullness of who they are, and with some compassion, so we can create more safe spaces. I think these systems have been so good, as was said earlier, at keeping us separate, at breaking things down, and by indoctrinating us to believe and bringing us up in so many patterns around disconnection, that it's easy to check out, or to not acknowledge all of the things that have come together to create this moment and to create life and our bodies. I got to be on a panel yesterday, a couple days ago, with Susan Raffel and Sun Young Shin. And Sun Young, I loved how she brought in talking about how, and guiding us through a practice of noticing the water that's in our bodies, and remembering that water is the same water that's in the ocean, that's in the rivers, that falls from the clouds, that the water in our bodies is ancient, that earth is in our bodies and it's ancient, that we have all of the elements of nature within us. And I, for myself, have found that when I know that I'm kind of getting caught in the gears of colonial ways, is one way to put it, is when I'm not feeling that connection, or when I'm moving really fast, when I don't have to. So when I think about ways that we can practice being together during these times, I think about these things, and having humility, just giving space for people to be able to try things and mess up and be human, I think is so important. Grace. I mean, if we can think back to any time we've messed up and someone's given us grace, how just what a gift that is, right? And vice versa. I know people really appreciate when there's space given to just be human. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really important is what you're doing now, which is naming it. That when we name that this is what we need, it allows other people to help figure that out, right? Or try to model that or be that. And, I've certainly learned over the years that when I do anything that feels like it's being effective in the work of organizing or social justice work, it's when I figured out a way to remind people of what they already know. And that also means to validate what people already know, because we all have these crazy ideas that we could all get along, treat each other nice, share stuff, but there's not a lot of validation from that in the general culture. And you get a pat on the head and that's very nice and we all feel the same way, but in the real world, ... So simply being able to name, it's just like the work around police abolition. If you name that in a way and keep the message coming, that actually there is a place waiting for us in which we treat each other differently, I think it gives us more wind in our sails to try to start embodying that, which indeed is how it leads to that place actually materializing. If that convoluted web of sentences can be unraveled.
Absolutely. And like you, Ayo, my heart's beating fast too. I'm holding on to every single one of your words. We wanted to kind of leave this last question open to you. Like, is there a question or reflection that you'd like to bring into the space today? And this is an open one. Anyone can start.
Ricardo, were you?
Yeah,
Yep.
Some things come to mind, but if either of you has anything, I would love to hold this one for a bit and hear what comes into your minds if you have an answer to that.
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind of organizing projects or community building initiatives that I am a part of. One of them is in Sierra Leone, West Africa, where around 2016, some of us went to rural Sierra Leone, to a village of one of our neighbors who currently lives in the Phillips neighborhood. And we talk with the village elders and adults and youth about building in what we called an early childhood center that would address a real immediate problem, like, can we organize something where young children could be in a safe place where they were learning something while their mothers went to work in the field? And, all kinds of things can happen when children are not supervised by their mother or another caring adult. So what the question we posed was, can we create an early childhood center and put it in the middle of, what we would recognize as being a permacultural farm, so that there wasn't a separation and the young children could be in a school, young children from the age of like 2 or 3 to 5, where they would have teachers, like regular teachers, and an elder in each of the 3 classrooms, learning, reading, writing, arithmetic, and the cultural wisdom from the elders. And that other than their classroom, the farm was another classroom that, had vegetables, good food, and also goats and chickens. And, around this was also a forest, which we feel that, okay, if children are exposed to nature and caring adults, they're going to be starting off their lives in a good way, plugged into reality. And here in the US, here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, starting something called Wild Seed, where people from various cultures and intergenerationally, and and all the complexity of how we're human in terms of race, sex, class, etc. Can we create a healing community that addresses a lot of our immediate needs in terms of food, healing, and other immediate things, as a community that's both rural, connected to people in the urban area, where we're learning together and providing for our immediate needs, and creating a community whose values, if replicated in other places, maybe those circles of human connection eventually will overlap, and we're sowing seeds for a new world culture.
And that's what happens in times of ecological change. That in the Everglades, you get pockets of cattails in disturbed areas, and that creates conditions, and the spores travel. Well, the next time there's disturbed areas, an area of sawgrass turns into an area of cattails. But it's partly these enclaves of the future slowly starting to link up together.
I love that. I feel like it's just a beautiful way to put what it is that we're doing now. It's like there's these different pockets of things that are happening in the ecosystem and in the world. And we have the opportunity to be inspired by each other and the things that we're creating. And there's something that just soothes my heart when I think about young people being connected to nature and receiving care, and the whole family being supported, that you brought in, Louis. I really, appreciate that. That's good work.
this, one of the things that often happens in conversations like this is that, whether it's a panel or interview or whatever, is that when you get to the end of the time, a moderator will ask, what gives you hope? And that, to me, it feels like partly sort of out of the desperation of what can you give me to hold on to overcome my despair? Because you look like you got your crap together, right? So how can you help me? And I find myself, well, two things. I mean, one is that I think hope is the inherent nature of organisms. You know, any bird that goes, or animal or squirrel that goes out scavenging in the morning is driven by hope that there'll be some tasty morsel to find, right? And that they won't get eaten by an owl. You know, so to me, the question is always what gets in the way. And I find that that's somehow, and we don't really have time to get into it now, but I still want to pose it. What interests me almost more is, what is it that keeps you from being hopeful or that gets in the way? What causes you fear or despair? Because that's where the medicine needs to go. That's how we need to feel to address it. And maybe it's something deep and personal about ourselves that was implanted early. Maybe it has something to do with the world on a huge scale. And we've been trained to think that the world on a huge scale is beyond our capacity to influence, right? So that's what I would actually, I find myself wanting to hear more from people. Is what's the problem? What's holding you back? What's blocking your road? What is making you worried about the success that you're reaching for? Because that to me feels like an agenda.
Oh, there's so much to explore and sit with, and time is never on our side with these conversations, because I know we could go down any one of these entry points and just get deeper. And I know that we will continue to do that with each other. But you know, I'm really sitting with this reflection of what the need to slow down, right? The need to not feel like everything is urgent and everything needs to be rushed to. And that sometimes that in that rushing, we're actually neglecting what we must attend to, and neglecting our own healing paths. And so I heard that in different ways from all three of you. And just the solid reminders of what it is to have a practice of healing within our own lives and within our own communities. I think it's become such a buzzword. Healing has become such a buzzword that it's important to remember the ways that we are. There is deep wisdom, and there's deep knowing, and there is deep practice around healing in our communities and our families, even if it is an unveiling that we need to do to get to that place. And it looks like Louis has one last thought here as we close out.
You know, well, I don't know how you came up with the three of us, but what gives me hope is that Ricardo is still creating art and making voice and writing, and Ayo is working with all of these healing paradigms and not locked away in a room mourning the death of something. Maybe death is happening, but also birth is always happening. And that they're alive and doing what they do gives me hope. It makes me feel like I'm not alone. We are doing this. We have a vision. We are making a road by just continuing to walk and recognizing which path has a beating heart. Okay, that's where we're going to continue.
And I think that's where we're gonna close. That's a beautiful way to wrap our time together up, Louis. Thank you for those parting words. Thank you to the three of you for being in conversation with us, for doing really just rooted, grounded, heart work in so many of our lives. And I feel really, really blessed to know you and to be in this conversation with you.
Thank you for holding and sewing the quilt.
Thank you. This has been beautiful. Mhm.